Now, as President Trump mulls staying and running Venezuela for many years, our next guest argues his critics are falling into an obvious trap with their response to Maduro's capture and the subsequent fallout. In a new essay, The Atlantic's David Frum warns that opponents of the administration are getting bogged down in the legalities of the military operation, and he's joining Michelle Martin to explain why he thinks Trump's critics are getting it all wrong and why their message keeps failing to break through.
Thanks, Christian. David Frum, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you.
You've been writing extensively about the U.S. incursion strike into Venezuela, seizing Nicolas Maduro and his wife, bringing him back to the U.S. to stand trial ostensibly for involvement in drug trafficking. Before we dig into a specific piece I wanted to talk about, I just wanted to ask you overall, what's your sense of that mission? What do you think?
People use the phrase regime change, but what we actually seem to have seen here is dictator change. The regime remains intact. Nicolas Maduro is not a charismatic dictator of the Fidel Castro type. He's an inheritor of a repressive military authoritarian system that was built by his predecessor, Hugo Chavez, who took power in the 1990s. So this regime has been there for 30 years. Maduro was the second in line. He inherited after Chavez died of cancer, and the system preceded him and can outlast him. So by removing him from the system, you don't necessarily change very much unless you change other things about the system too. But the Trump administration seems quite determined to leave the rest of that system intact because I think they believe, this seems to be the thread of rationality, is the other people in the system are more amenable to pressure and maybe even more corrupt than Nicolas Maduro, as they can do business with them while refusing to do anything to bring the legitimate, democratically elected government of Venezuela back to power. Venezuela had an election a year ago. It was intended to be a fake, but the will of the people was so strong that it overwhelmed the fake, and we now have a legitimate president of Venezuela recognized by the United States and other democratic countries.
So do you buy the administration's rationale for this? They're saying this isn't a war, so they didn't have to notify Congress or seek congressional approval. They're saying it's a law enforcement operation to basically interdict or interrupt a drug trafficking operation. Do you buy it?
Well, which one do I buy? Because I think there are at least three explanations of what has happened, and they contradict one another. So I can't believe them all. And when there are three different ones, I'm probably inclined to believe none of them. But so the one rationale is, yes, this is a law enforcement operation to seize somebody who's been indicted by a United States court. Another is, no, this is an anti-drug operation intended to stop the flow of drugs from Venezuela to the rest of the world. No. This is a war for oil intended to seize Venezuela's oil resources and annex them to the United States. Those can't
or to recover oil resources that were improperly taken 20 years ago.
Or that's another. Maybe that's now four. So different people have the vice president has put forth an explanation. The president has put forth an explanation. The secretary of state has put forth an explanation. The secretary of defense, or secretary of war, as he likes to style himself, has put forward an explanation. But they're all contradictory. So which one should I believe?
There are a lot of reasons why people object. People from across the political spectrum are objecting to what just occurred here. But one of the things that you're saying in your piece, which got my attention, is you're saying that Trump's critics are falling into an obvious trap. What is the trap?
What Trump wants you to believe is this is a patriotic operation done by the skilled armed forces of the United States to serve an American national interest. It was heroically and faultlessly executed. And now there's just a lot of petty carping with international law, which no true American would ever care about. And it's just a lot of legalistic gibberish that is standing in the way of appreciating the great patriotic achievement. And one of the things I'm trying to say is, whatever this was not done for the national interest. My guess, and this is only a guess, is that this oil talk, it reveals something real. I mean, obviously, seizing Venezuela's oil makes no economic sense for the United States.
Well, stop there for a second. Why not?
So the present price of oil is $58 a barrel. The United States of America is the largest producer of oil in the world. At $58 a barrel, American producers, many of them have trouble breaking even. Add Canada, which used to be a friend of the United States, and North America produces 28% of all the oil produced in the world. The idea that you need another 1 million barrels a day is crazy, especially when you consider how much will it cost to bring Venezuela's oil to market. The Venezuela oil reserves are located in jungly terrain in the far east of the country. There's been no meaningful investment there for 30 years. There aren't enough roads. It's heavy oil, which has to be brought to it doesn't bubble spontaneously to the surface. You have to inject steam into the ground to bring the oil to the top. Steam takes electricity. Guess what there aren't a lot of in the jungles of eastern Venezuela? Hydroelectric power plants or grids to connect them or pumping stations. There aren't adequate security. So if there are insurgencies or guerrillas there, the whole thing is just bonkers. So for a fraction of the cost it would take to bring any Venezuelan oil to market, you can bring a lot more U.S. or Canadian oil to market. And the problem is the market is saying at $58 a barrel, actually, you know what? We got enough. We don't need more.
You've managed to articulate this in a very few minutes. You say that Trump's critics are getting it wrong. Where are they getting it wrong?
They're getting bogged down in legalisms. Because when you say this is about how Maduro was arrested, or when you say anything that carries any whiff of defense of this terrible dictator, you're allowing Trump to stage a false argument as if it were the true one. You're allowing him to claim that what has to happen here is not something done for the national interest. There is we'll learn more about it. There's some shady element to all of this. And that's the place where you need to focus. And the problem is we're all kind of conservative in a small c sense. We all want to remember arguments we used to have and to think about a normal American presidency who does things for a normal American way. And it's just hard for people in Congress, a big institution, hard for people in the media to say, you know what, there's probably a corrupt motive here. And even if it's not immediately obvious what that corrupt motive is, just wait 72 hours and it will become obvious. But don't start with the premise that what you're seeing here is Iraq or Panama or one of those previous struggles replayed. This is something different. This is about somebody having a get-rich-quick scheme, and we just it'll take a little while to discover who that somebody is.
It's interesting. Who do you think should be articulating that argument? Should it be members of Congress? Should it be public intellectuals like yourself? Who should be saying that?
I think there are things that members of Congress can think without having to say. Obviously, a member of Congress needs to wait if there is a corrupt scheme here. You don't want to say that until you have more proof of exactly what the corrupt scheme is. But they need to keep in mind that that's probably what is going on here, and not to allow old habits to drive them into the instinctive response to whatever international law means, that's what was violated here, because that will sound to a lot of Americans like just pettifogging and denigrating a great American military victory, when that's not what happened here. We haven't had a great American military victory. We've had a raid that's apprehended a genuine wrongdoer, but probably for reasons that won't bear a lot of public scrutiny when they're revealed.
In their sort of statements initially, most Republicans were on board. Most Republicans supported it, and Democrats are skeptical. But there are some Republicans who have expressed the same doubts that you have, who said that this doesn't make sense according to the market. It doesn't make sense according to past patterns of behavior. I mean, the president just pardoned the former president of Honduras, who was convicted of trafficking enormous amounts of drugs into the United States, convicted in an American court. And so they've pointed out the inconsistencies that you have pointed out. They've pointed out it makes no sense from a market perspective. Do you think any of those arguments are penetrating?
No, I think there's a habit here. So there is a long tradition, going back to George Washington's time, of arguments between more interventionist and more isolationist Americans. Those are very familiar arguments, complicated arguments, a lot of good faith on both sides. And I think there are people who would like to support Trump, who want to see us revert to the interventionist versus isolationist argument, and to say, well, President Trump pretended to be an isolationist, now he's acting as an interventionist, he's contradicting himself, but at least we're back in our familiar landscape. And we don't have to adjust to the strange new world in which we live, where those arguments are not relevant to what's happening now. Trump is planning, apparently, or it's rumored or reported or claimed by members of the administration, to follow up what he did in Venezuela by doing a Pearl Harbor on Denmark. Now, whatever that is, that's not a part of our old isolationist versus interventionist arguments anymore, because there's never been an interventionist in American history who said what intervention means is doing a Pearl Harbor on a NATO ally.
Mm-hmm. So So the question then becomes, though, if the arguments are as clear as you have articulated them, why aren't more people making them?
Because back of what I'm saying are some really upsetting things that we don't like to think about. I mean, a lot of people who are critical of this administration say, it's corrupt. It's corrupt. But there are other things going on. If you take that argument seriously, it's very upsetting. We don't have a presidency that has scandals. We have a scandal that is running a presidency. That the scandal is the story. And there are many particular scandals, but there's one big scandal, which is a president and his family using the office for self-enrichment on a scale not only never seen in American history, but never seen in the history of any democratic country at all. You have to look to post-colonial Africa or post-Soviet Soviet Union to see comparable billion-dollar scales of self-enrichment. And we want to believe that the country we grew up in, that we loved, the institutions we revere are there. And it's just hard. It's just hard to take on board the scale of what has been done to American institutions, especially in the second Trump presidency, but generally since 2016.
A lot of people think that one of the difficulties of America's culture right now is just a sort of a nihilism, a cynicism about everything. I mean, there's one sort of theory about the loss of confidence in the legacy media, for example, is this too negative, too cynical? But you're saying it's the opposite, is that there's a sort of a willingness and an unwillingness to really see something as clearly as it needs to be seen, to be as negative as the moment calls for.
In pro-institutional America, and especially, I mean, people who watch a program like this, we're older. We remember many presidents. We remember an America that for most of us has been a good place for us. We remember that America has been a force for good in the world. We remember the coming down of the Berlin Wall. We remember the spread of democracy in the 1990s. We remember the end of apartheid in South Africa, the end of the dictatorship in Chile, Taiwan and South Korea becoming democracies, Mexico turning into a multi-party democracy. For me, that's yesterday. And we remember a United States in which there's dignity. And however foul-mouthed politicians are in private, when they appear in public, they're dignified. If someone dies, they don't mock the dead. And when you have a president who, when someone dies in the most tragic, horrific way, his instinct is, let me go mock that person. Let me see if the family's not miserable enough. Let me see if the president of the United States can add a little something to the family's misery. It's hard to adjust to that world. We don't want to be there. And so it's easy for those of us in pro-institutional America to say, okay, the real story here is what Marco Rubio is saying to the German chancellor, because that feels like America as we knew it.
What should members of Congress be doing right now?
If I had one wish, I would have a joint House and Senate resolution saying that any presidential order to attack the territory of a NATO ally is by that fact an illegal order, and obedience to it is an act of obeying an illegal order. Treaties of the United States are the law of the land. According to the Constitution, a treaty is every bit as much law as any statute of Congress. And if a president orders a general officer to attack a NATO ally without first canceling the NATO treaty, that's an illegal order. I'd like to see Congress pass that. I'd like to see Congress pass a resolution recognizing the winner, Edmundo Gonzalez, the winner of the 2024 election, the person recognized by the United States and almost all of America's allies and most countries in Latin America as the rightful president of Venezuela. I'd like them to put some muscle behind that you don't want to send troops to Venezuela, but the goal should be bring Edmundo Gonzalez to lawful power and in a negotiated way. So that would be the best outcome. But you need to know where you're going, and bringing the proper legitimate president of Venezuela to power. That should be the American goal, not empowering the next dictator in line.
Why do you think it is that this administration is so reluctant to acknowledge this election? I mean, which, as you pointed out, most governments around the world have done.
Well, there may be a lot of petty reasons, but I think there's one big one, which is if you took this idea seriously, you'd be signing up for a big challenge. Venezuela was a very successful country from the 1950s to the 1990s. It fell into disrepair under Chavez and into chaos under Maduro. So bringing Venezuela back to what it used to be, using its oil resources for the benefit of the Venezuelan people, that's a big project. It also means that you'd have to stop seeing the quarter of the country that has been driven into exile, 8 million people. by the way, the largest group of them in Colombia, but many in the United States, you have to stop seeing them as invaders and threats and criminals who should be sent to torture prisons. And the act of repatriation is not one that involves a way stop at a torture prison, but involves some way to say, how do we take all the capital and the know-how that has left Venezuela and encourage it to repatriate, at least in part, and to reconstruct the country. This would be a big project. And one more thing, that one of the reasons they're reluctant to do it is if you want to do the project at reasonable cost to the American people, then you need partners. So, this is not going to be an American. We're going to work with Mexico and Colombia and Brazil.
Colombia. Mm-hmm.
And that we're going to do. I mean, I think when I think about how this military intervention went, how differently would it have gone if the president had delivered his message, not flanked by his own administration, but flanked by other presidents from Latin America, backed by a resolution of Congress? I think that wouldn't happen for this president, but I think a lot of people think, ending a dictatorship in Venezuela, helping that is rejected by his own people in a democratic vote, where it's a big reconstruction project. We need partners, we need friends, and we need permission from Congress.
Before we let you go, I want to loop back to where we started our conversation, and here's where I'm asking you to speculate. Do you have a theory about why this happened? As you pointed out, the administration has given multiple reasons, some of which are contradictory.
I have a guess. It's not really a theory. I think the United States has suffered this terrible flow of drug deaths from opioids, not from the drugs that come from Venezuela, which are mostly cocaine. The Trump administration, many of the people there feel those deaths very intensely, as they should, and want to do something about it. But they want to do something that blames foreigners, that says the reason Americans are dying is not because of things that are wrong in American life. It's not that we need some change in the way we do things here. It's someone else is doing this to us, the urge to blame others. Now, their first attention was to Mexico, which is where actually most of the fentanyl flows from. And before, in the year 23 and 24, there were a lot of talk from people who would become important in the Trump administration about actually using military action inside Mexico. And I wrote about this for The Atlantic. Once in power, it became clear this Mexico war scheme was not very feasible. And anyway, the Mexicans went very far to cooperate with the United States and with the Trump administration. But that urge to do something violent, to stop drugs that are blamed on others, not to look inward, but to look outward for a villain, I think that impulse shifted from Mexico to attach itself to Venezuela. And the irony, of course, is that there genuinely is a big drug flow problem via Mexico. There isn't such a big drug flow problem through Venezuela, but it was a place where those feelings could go. And instead of looking inward and saying, why is it that so many Americans are harming themselves in this way? And so many more than were harming themselves just 15 years ago. Why? What changes need to be made here so that Americans are less inclined to take drugs? They're met with better care when they get it. That anti-overdose remedies are more easily and freely available. Those are, all of that requires thinking and planning, and not just anger and violence.
David Frum, thank you for talking with us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Next, to another individual who has committed his life to his ideals. In 2022, Kenneth Roth left Human Rights Watch after 30 years at the helm, during which the organization grew dramatically, conducting investigations in more than 100 countries to uncover abuses. Speaking to Walter Isaacson, Roth discusses his new book, which digs into his 3 decades leading the charge for human rights. And they also speak about the major challenges today. Here's their conversation.
Thank you, Paula and Kenneth Roth. Welcome back to the show.
Very nice to be with you.
You've led Human Rights Watch for 30 years, and now you're out with a book about it. It's called Righting Wrongs, 3 Decades on the Front Lines Battling Abusive Governments. Take us back to what first inspired your interest in human rights.
A big part of it was my father's experience. He fled Nazi Germany in July 1938 as a 12-year-old boy heading to New York. And so I grew up with Hitler stories of what it was like to be a young Jewish boy living under the Nazis. And that made me very aware of the evil that governments could do, and made me determined to devote my life to try to stop that kind of conduct.
Are we backsliding now from the human rights fight?
Well, this is clearly a difficult moment in the sense that, Trump has arrived, the autocrats feel emboldened. But I actually think it's a complicated time for autocrats. The two most prominent ones, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, have both made big mistakes because they operate in an echo chamber with no debate allowed. Putin invaded Ukraine. Xi Jinping is destroying the economy. When you look around the world, people living under autocracy don't want it. They come into the streets at risk of arrest or even being shot. And, sometimes they succeed in places like Bangladesh or Sri Lanka. Other times they don't. In Belarus, Russia, Uganda, Hong Kong. But the people make their preferences clear. I think the real challenge today is in established Western democracies, where people who feel left behind, that democracy is not delivering to them, that they're not respected, they're not heard, are ripe for the autocrat's appeal. And I think the real challenge now is to bolster the established democracies. The people who live under autocracies don't want it. It's the people in democracies who are having second thoughts.
Are you talking about the United States?
Well, certainly the United States, but if you look throughout Europe, the far-right parties are doing well. Often, most typically they don't gain power, with the exception of Hungary with Viktor Orban, but they are threatening. And that, I think is a concern, and it speaks to the difficulty these governments have of really answering to the day-to-day needs of their entire society.
I always think of you and Human Rights Watch in places like China or Russia where there's, gross violations of human rights. Do you think the human rights community should be involved in Western Europe elections now?
Well, the human rights community has been involved in the West. We always have. The idea that democracies don't violate human rights, that's just not true. Think back to the George W. Bush administration, the systematic torture, the sending people to Guantanamo for endless detention without charge or trial. So yes, we do have to monitor Western democracies, and that's not even talking about, how they wage wars. If you look at how Israel has conducted itself in Gaza. So there, we are an equal opportunity monitor and reporter, and we've got to look, at the classic autocrats, but also at the established democracies.
You just said about how Israel has waged war in Gaza. Let me read you something. You said, no one can justify a war crime by contending that the other side committed war crimes too. I assume you were talking about Israel. Is that what happened there? And what could we have done?
Well, that is a basic rule of international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions and their like, which is, because in war, everybody charges the other side with war crimes. And so if that were enough to justify your own war crimes, there quickly would be no protection for civilians. But the rule is that, even if one side, say Hamas, committed war crimes on October 7th, which it did by killing and abducting civilians and holding them for months on end, that does not justify Israel's own war crimes. It's indiscriminate bombardment, it's attacks with hugely disproportionate civilian consequences, the starvation strategy, the destruction of hospitals. So it's important to keep that distinction straight and to monitor each side by the terms of international humanitarian law.
What should we have done?
Well, I think Joe Biden never really used the leverage that he had. He pressed the Netanyahu government to, end its starvation strategy, to pay more attention to the bombing and the toll that was taking on civilians. The only thing he did was to suspend the delivery of these huge 2,000-pound bombs that were decimating neighborhoods. But otherwise, he continued the military aid, he continued the arms sales, and Netanyahu thought that, okay, I'll put up with a few verbal protests, but he's not stopping me. He could have been much tougher and could have saved many, many lives.
You've written, too, about it, that no aspect of our work was more closely scrutinized than our reporting on Israel. And I think it rebounded on you personally at times. You had to deal with it. Tell me about that.
Yes. Well, there is no country out there that has a more organized group of defenders than Israel. So at Human Rights Watch, we knew that every time we published something critical about Israel, we would be lambasted. That was just life. And so I personally scrutinized everything we put out to make sure that it was factually accurate, that it was principled in its application of humanitarian or human rights standards, that we were applying the same standards as every place else in the world. And once it passed my scrutiny, we put it out. When I was then accused of being anti-Semitic, which is a very common criticism, I would say, you're cheapening the concept of anti-Semitism. This is a very important concept. Jews around the world are endangered by anti-Semitism. But if people think that this just becomes an excuse to defend Israel, you're going to be harming Jews around the world. And it's important to say that. Otherwise, this kind of misuse of anti-Semitism will continue to try to cover up Israeli war crimes and the like.
And you think there have been Israeli war crimes?
Oh, there is no question that there have been Israeli war crimes. I've written extensively on this. The use of these huge bombs to decimate entire neighborhoods is completely contrary to the rules of war that say you've got to target particular military targets, not treat entire neighborhoods as fair game. Similarly, Israel, it's now become clear by just the Israeli media's own reporting, would justify killing up to 20 civilians just to go after one Hamas fighter. That's a clearly illegal war crime, disproportionate attack. And then finally, if you just look at the starvation strategy, the fact that during the current temporary ceasefire, suddenly the food is flowing in, people are okay, just highlights how much the starvation up until the beginning of this temporary ceasefire was a deliberate Israeli policy.
And I know that can't be justified by Palestinian war crimes, but what did you think when you saw this past week when the bodies of the Israeli hostages and the way they were treated and how they were returned?
Hamas is despicable. I never defend Hamas. They're a military dictatorship in Gaza. The atrocities they committed on October 7th were horrible. They should never have been holding the hostages. They've been mistreating them. They've been forcing them to go through these, charades to demonstrate Hamas's power. All of that, much of that is a war crime itself. But as I mentioned, that does not justify Israel's own war crimes, just as, Hamas's tendency to hide behind civilians, to use human shields, does not relieve Israel of the responsibility still not to launch indiscriminate attacks, not to attack when the harm to civilians will be disproportionate.
And what do you think in terms of human rights issues of the plan Trump has been pushing, I think, to clear Palestinians out of Gaza?
Yeah, this would be, not only a massive war crime, it would be a crime against humanity. Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention prohibits forcibly deporting or expelling the civilian population of occupied territory. Trump is just ripping that up and saying, let's do it anyway. Now, the rest of the Arab world is saying, no way. They remember 1948, the so-called Nakba, or catastrophe, where Palestinians were forced out of the new state of Israel, given a one-way ticket and never allowed back. That clearly, as Trump has said, is the plan with the 2 million Palestinians that are living in Gaza today. But the rest of the Arab states are saying, no way, we're not going to be complicit in that war crime.
When you talk about human rights abuses, you often focus rightly, I think, on Vladimir Putin and what Russia has done and then what Russia is doing in Ukraine. What would happen if in the next 2 weeks there is a peace imposed, I could say, or maybe just a peace agreed to in the region in which Putin gets to keep a lot of disputed territory and Ukraine is not allowed in NATO?
Well, Walter, I think that, in fact, those two possibilities are quite likely, but that's not really the issue. I don't think anybody feels that it's going to be possible for Ukraine to recapture the territory that Russia has occupied. Formal NATO invitations are just not on the table. But what Ukraine is looking for is a real security guarantee, a guarantee that Russia won't use a ceasefire to just rearm and reinvade in a year or two. And that is what, Trump needs to offer. The Europeans are very much willing to put that on the table. But if Trump just says, take the ceasefire, go home, we're not going to worry about anything else, that will be essentially, the appeasement, the 21st century equivalent of Neville Chamberlain. That will be, a horrible deal that Trump, the supposed master negotiator, would be complicit in.
What is the role of shame that you use in pursuing human rights?
Well, in today's world, every government has to pretend to respect human rights. This is a basic aspect of their legitimacy. Now, we know that many governments don't. And what Human Rights Watch does, in a sense, is shine a spotlight on that discrepancy. We investigate carefully what they're doing, report on the misconduct. And that difference between pretense and reality is embarrassing, it's delegitimizing, and it's shameful. Governments go to great lengths to resist it. Now, it doesn't mean that a dictator has personal remorse. I'm not trying to do, a psychological conversion here. But in order to maintain legitimacy, in order to maintain this pretense that they're serving their people, not themselves, they want to be seen as human rights respecters. That's what gives Human Rights Watch the power to show that that pretense is not reality.
So Human Rights Watch, does it in a private way, fighting for human rights around the world. And I think you sometimes pressure the U.S. government to take stances in favor of human rights. How do you divide up what a non-governmental organization like yourself should do and what you think the U.S. government should do?
Well, Human Rights Watch, in addition to reporting on human rights violations and shining a spotlight of shame on the abuser, we also go to influential governments that purport to support human rights in their foreign policies. Not just the United States, but most of Europe and parts of Latin America and the like. And so that, in a sense, diplomatic side is very important because we will say, okay, what does the target government care about? And how can we deprive them of that until they improve their human rights practices? And they always want something. You got to look at what they want. So it could be, a military aid package. It could be an arms sale. It could be preferential trade benefits. Sometimes it's just getting invited to a fancy summit so they can be photographed with legitimate leaders to show the folks back home that, I'm okay because look who I hang out with. So we will go to the leader of a democratic country and say, don't give them that until they change. Now, traditionally we do this a lot with the U.S. government under Trump. I don't have great confidence, but, we've lived through Trump before and we've done it with others. I described in the book, in fact, I open up an effort to get Putin to stop bombing civilians in Idlib province in northwestern Syria. And this was during the Trump administration, the first one. Trump was not going to be a reliable ally here, but it was by turning to German Chancellor Angela Merkel, French President Emmanuel Macron, and the Turkish President Erdogan, we persuaded those three to pressure Putin to stop bombing hospitals and apartment buildings and markets and the like in Idlib. And it stopped in March 2020. It stopped entirely for 3 years. It revived a little bit after that. And then that was the territory from which this rebel group came to overthrow the Assad government. So that made a huge difference for the people on the ground. They no longer feared death from the skies. And that was possible really because we worked with democracies to put pressure on the target.
You begin your chapter on China by arguing that it's the biggest threat to human rights today. And here's a sentence that was sort of notable. Beijing's actions, if unchecked, portends a dystopian future in which no one is beyond the reach of Chinese censors. Unpack that for me.
Well, the Chinese government is, in my view, the greatest threat because it devotes enormous resources from the world's second largest economy to try to suppress criticism of it around the world. So it's not simply that it represses dissent within China, but it uses the threat of denying access to the Chinese market to censor people around the world. It uses transnational repression. If you're a Uyghur dissident in New York, your parents back at home are going to be threatened if you don't shut up. And so they are really quite ruthless in trying to prevent criticism. They go the next step. They're actually trying to rewrite human rights law, which is quite detailed about, not only things like freedom of the media or free speech, the right to due process, also economic and social rights, the right to housing and all. They want to reduce everything to basically, are we expanding the economy? Do we provide security? And are people happy? However they measure that. And this is a kind of a radical dumbing down of the very detailed human rights standards to try to make Xi Jinping look good. To say the economy's growing, that's all you need to know. And that is a real threat to the human rights movement. Nobody else is attempting something so radical.
There have been these cuts in USAID and Doge, Elon Musk going in cutting things. How does the potential decimation of our soft power affect our ability on human rights?
Well, with the global effect of USAID, on the one hand, it's an incredibly important institution to provide, basic healthcare, basic education, basic sanitation, things that people need in poor countries all the time. The other thing that I'm worried about is that by destroying USAID, Trump is essentially giving a gift to autocrats, because a big part of what USAID does, it may not be as widely known, is that it promotes human rights defenders, independent journalists, democracy promoters, the kinds of independent voices that autocrats hate. And a lot of these are being forced to shut down because Trump has turned off the spigot.
Do you think the Human Rights Watch will now take on Donald Trump?
Well, we have to. In other words, if his deportation scheme with undocumented migration leads to, again, family separation or needless detention or various physical abuses against migrants, we're going to have to look at that. If his attacks on DEI reintroduces racial discrimination into the criminal justice system, we have to look at that. And of course, in his foreign policy, I do still think that there are openings to move Trump because, on the one hand, yes, this guy, can't find an autocrat he doesn't want to cozy up to. He flouts human rights standards, but he also sees himself as a master deal maker. And that gives us an opening because if he ignores human rights, he's going to make bad deals. In Gaza, he played a useful role in forcing Netanyahu to agree to the current temporary ceasefire. If he wants his bigger regional deal, the normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel, he's going to have to push Netanyahu to accept a Palestinian state. If he did that, he would deserve the Nobel Peace Prize. So I think that we can, push him in a positive direction, playing on his ego, playing on his desire for recognition. And, it may or may not work, but I think this is our best strategy to try to make progress.
Ken Roth, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed our conversation.
And now, the matter of weaponizing the American justice system. President Trump is escalating his pressure on the Justice Department to go after his political opponents. And inside the DOJ, career prosecutors are reeling from ousters, resignations, and relentless interference, they say, from the White House. Michelle Martin spoke with former federal prosecutor Brendan Ballou to discuss how far this campaign could go. And to note, their conversation took place just before reports that prosecutors in Virginia are moving to indict the former FBI director James Comey, who Trump considers his enemy.
Thanks, Christiane. Brendan Ballou, thanks so much for joining us once again.
Thank you.
Just to remind, you are a former federal prosecutor. You actually prosecuted cases from the January 6th attack. It's one of the reasons you left government, because of the way that things have transpired since. A number of people, analysts, people like yourself, people who understand how the Department of Justice has worked, is supposed to work, are calling this an extraordinary moment. Why are they saying that?
Well, we're watching the increasingly political nature of the Department of Justice and the collapse of the credibility of the Department of Justice. The DOJ is unlike other agencies. It's not like NASA that has spaceships or Department of Defense that has, tanks. The only thing the Justice Department has is its credibility. And to see so many attacks on that credibility so quickly, it's extraordinary. And I worry that the Justice Department that I knew may no longer exist or won't exist very soon.
Did you think it would be different? I mean, people might remember that the President Trump initially nominated a congressman, Matt Gaetz, to be the head of Justice Department. It became clear that he could not win confirmation. The current Attorney General, Pam Bondi, is a prosecutor of experience. Did you think it would be different?
Maybe I was being overly optimistic or naive, but I thought that there would be at least two limits on this president's intervention in the Justice Department. The first related to January 6th, which is, as soon as Donald Trump got reelected as president, I assumed that some portion of the rioters would get pardoned. But, Donald Trump campaigned on a pro-cop agenda, and I assumed that agenda would limit his decision to pardon, for instance, rioters that attack police officers. So I thought that would be one way that Trump would be insulated or be contained. The other way is purely out of self-interest, which is the Department of Justice only works if it's able to convince judges and juries to agree with it. And when DOJ becomes increasingly political, or appears to become increasingly political, it loses that ability to persuade. And so at some level, I thought that the White House would want to keep some distance from DOJ solely so that it could be more effective. But obviously, that's not the case.
What are the sort of the data points that lead you to that conclusion?
Well, you look at the appointment of obviously unqualified U.S. attorneys to various positions in the Eastern District of Virginia, in New Jersey. These people have literally no prosecutorial experience, but because of their personal connections to the president, they're getting these incredibly important jobs. You see it in the fact that certain kinds of crimes simply aren't being pursued anymore. When you're talking about foreign bribery, when we're talking about acting as an agent of a foreign power, when you're talking about being a Russian kleptocrat, these were things that the Department of Justice used to prosecute, no longer. And I think you see it in the fact that the president is explicitly calling out that he plans to or wants to prosecute his political enemies.
So there are two things that have been in the news. The first was, and you alluded to this, U.S. Attorney Eric Siebert in Virginia refused to bring charges against Letitia James. She's the Attorney General of New York State, and James Comey, the former FBI director. Siebert resigned. He was clearly pressured to resign because he couldn't find a reason to bring charges against Letitia James. And so then, this weekend, President Trump posted on his social media platform directly addressing the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, saying, quote, "Nothing is being done. What about Comey, Adam Shifty Schiff, he's the current senator from California, Letitia? They're all guilty as hell, but nothing is going to be done. No, I fired him, and there's a great case, and we can't delay any longer. Justice must be served now," in all caps with multiple sort of exclamation marks. So, gosh, how unusual is it for a president to be talking about demanding prosecutions of specific individuals?
It seems entirely unprecedented. I've certainly never heard of it. I've never heard of anybody that's heard of it. At one level, it's incredibly heartbreaking to see a post like that, to see the president explicitly try to use the Justice Department as a weapon against his political foes. A little bit more tactically, I think if you are the defense attorney for Tish James or Adam Schiff or James Comey, a post like that is incredibly helpful to your future defense. One thing that defendants will often try to bring is a claim of what's called selective prosecution. This idea that the government is prosecuting you unfairly for an impermissible purpose. Now, the challenge with those sorts of claims typically is it's very hard to show the government's intent. Well, here, the president just revealed the government's intent. So if the president's goal is to successfully prosecute his political enemies, I think he made that project harder for himself.
Well, the other thing is, you mentioned defendants. He says that they're all guilty as hell, but he doesn't say of what.
Exactly. I mean, it's a defendant in search of a crime. It seems clear that he wants the Department of Justice to be an arm of a larger project of retribution. I think the one good sign here is you look at how grand juries are responding to these sorts of threats. There's the old saw about that a prosecutor could indict a ham sandwich. Well, at the District of Columbia, the U.S. attorney is really struggling to indict ham sandwiches. And, in a perhaps unprecedented set of cases has failed to secure indictments repeatedly. And so I think that these sorts of posts are both going to help defense attorneys, but they're also going to make grand juries more skeptical and make it harder for this administration to secure indictments in the first place. There have been a number of cases now where the grand jury in D.C. has refused to indict, proposed cases that U.S. Attorney Jeanine Pirro has brought. What I think this suggests is that, at least in the District of Columbia, the Department of Justice is rapidly eviscerating its own credibility and struggling to persuade grand juries to indict. I think it'll be interesting to see with, more posts like this from the president, with more proposed political prosecutions, whether other jurisdictions start doing the same thing.
But I have to ask you whether the purpose of these kinds of statements, investigations, even prosecutions, should they occur, is it really to get convictions? Or is it really more to make people's lives uncomfortable or unpleasant? it can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to defend yourself in a case, especially a high-profile case, where the full weight of the federal government is being brought to bear, okay? So I have to wonder, do you really think convictions are the point, or is it just to make people's lives hell?
I can't predict what the president thinks internally, but it certainly seems like he wants to prosecute these people. He wants to imprison them. He explicitly says that he's trying to get revenge for the fact that he was prosecuted. Mm-hmm. I completely agree that simply being investigated, simply being indicted is incredibly stressful. And it's incredibly expensive, defending yourself, even if you aren't convicted, even if you don't go to jail or prison. That said, every time this administration brings an unsuccessful case, it loses more credibility and makes it harder for it to pursue political prosecutions in the future. So this is another example where I think this administration might be undermining its own objectives.
You made the point about people taking positions in the Justice Department for which they are not qualified, but it is also the case, or at least don't have any prior experience, but it's also the case that there are lawyers leaving who have specific credentials. And to that end, the public integrity section, which was tasked with prosecuting corruption, has been reportedly reduced from more than 30 attorneys to just 2. And I wonder what that says to you about the kinds of crimes that will be prosecuted or even investigated.
I think the news that the public integrity section of the Justice Department is down to just 2 attorneys shows that certain kinds of crimes and certain kinds of criminals are beyond the reach of the law in this administration. I will add that, when you're talking about an exodus of experience from the Department of Justice, one of the questions that I think every attorney in government needs to ask themselves right now, every employee in government needs to ask themselves right now, is whether they can be more effective by staying or by leaving. I think that there's always an argument that by staying in the Department of Justice or staying in government, you can stop the worst impulses of some of these political actors. But in a world where this administration is simply going to fire those who disagree with them, arguably, by staying in government, you're simply adding your own credibility, inadvertently, to these highly political actions. And so it's a very tough decision. But I think everybody in government needs to be asking themselves, how can they be most effective in maintaining the work, the dignity, and the reputation of the government they work for?
You've said that this is, quote, a great time to be a rich criminal. What did you mean by that?
Well, it goes back to what this administration is choosing to prosecute and what this administration is choosing not to prosecute. It is choosing not to prosecute people that may have committed crimes under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which prohibits foreign bribery, under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which prohibits acting as an unregistered agent of a foreign power. It's disbanded the Klepto Capture Task Force that was meant to go after Russian oligarchs. So, in all these different ways, if you are a rich criminal in America, it is a fabulous time to be working right now.
Do you think that people understand the consequences of this or the relevance of this to their own lives? And if not, who's going to make that case to them?
Maybe I'm being overly optimistic here, but the signs from the grand jury in D.C., the fact that the D.C. U.S. Attorney is struggling to secure all of these indictments, is one piece of evidence that people who aren't particularly engaged in politics, grand jurors, are rarely lawyers, they're regular folks that exist in the district, that they are seeing how seemingly corrupt or misguided these prosecutions are, I think is really encouraging. In a time when so many guardrails that we expected to constrain this president have completely fallen off, whether it's the Supreme Court, whether it's Congress, whether it's corporate America, the fact that you're seeing ordinary citizens resist this, I think is deeply encouraging. And it suggests that maybe the tools that we thought were going to be effective in fighting against corruption and fighting against illiberalism aren't going to work, but other tools and regular people might succeed.
Is it possible that a lot of people look at this and think, well, that's just the way it always worked? And it's just more obvious now that rich people, well-connected people, there was one set of rules for them, and that other people had different sets of rules. Is it possible that many people think that's just the way it's always been, and this is just more obvious now? I don't know.
I can't speak to public polling data on this, and what people generally feel about the current way that the Justice Department is being used to go after political enemies and shield political friends. And I think that there's an argument to be made that corruption is an unfortunate part of American history. So I can't speak to whether or not there's a change here or a feeling that things are truly different. But again, this is maybe an opportunity for hope, which is if this is a continuation of past corruption, it's occurring on such a vastly larger scale that it's hard for people to ignore. And when it's hard for people to ignore, maybe they're going to stand up and actually try to resist it. So at some level, this might be an opportunity to make some big structural changes.
Why should people care about this? I mean, a lot of people might think this isn't going to affect me.
Yeah.
So what would you say to somebody who felt that way?
A couple of things. So one, even if you aren't particularly political, even if you aren't breaking the law, how the government treats people, how it treats both political friends and enemies matters enormously, because due process and civil rights either apply to everyone or they apply to no one. Because if certain people are accepted from due process, it means that the president is going to be the one who decides who gets rights and who gets treated fairly, and we don't want that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we are already starting to see this corruption infecting so many parts of every American's life. You're watching the Jimmy Kimmel drama unfold right now. A lot of people watch Jimmy Kimmel. You're watching this happen in certain favored industries get protection when you have crypto scammers paying $5 million to get their investigations by the government dropped, when you're seeing banks pay $1 million to get their consent decrees lifted. This kind of corruption affects every person and it affects them every day.
How are you, thinking about all this? I mean, you took an oath, right? You passed the bar. You took an oath to uphold the standards of your profession. You went to the Justice Department. You took an oath to uphold the Constitution. And there are a lot of people like you who thought they were doing justice. And I'm just wondering, how are you thinking about this? You've mentioned several times a sort of a sense of optimism. I'm just curious where that comes from.
Well, two things. One, how am I feeling? How are my colleagues feeling? I can't speak for everybody, but it is obviously incredibly disheartening to watch the Justice Department be abused in this way and used as a political tool. It's certainly the case that, there are instances of corruption in the past, from both parties, from Watergate to, Lyndon Johnson and beyond. This is qualitatively different. You don't have a history of a president pardoning rioters who attack police because they support him politically. You don't have instances of allegations of people accepting literal cash in paper bags and then staying in office. You don't have examples of a president with business dealings where foreign governments work with them or give them literally jets in order to get favored foreign policy. So we're seeing things that are qualitatively different and on a massive scale. In terms of my optimism, what I think is, because this corruption is happening on such a massive scale, it is increasingly hard for anybody to ignore. And in a world where the Department of Justice is not interested in prosecuting corruption and trying to build a fairer democracy, I think other institutions are going to step up. If DOJ is not interested in prosecuting crypto scammers who pay to get their investigations dropped, well, competitors or consumers who are harmed by that behavior can sue in state and federal court to try to get justice. And so, again, I have a sense of optimism here because I think that people are increasingly engaged, and I think that engaged people have a lot of tools to take action here.
Brendan Ballou, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you.
Well, now, the recent pause on international student visas is just one of many signs pointing to the Trump administration's hostility towards diversity and immigrants. But historically, these communities have played a big role in shaping today's America, like the Chinese Americans, whose important role have often been overlooked in history books. Executive editor of The New Yorker, Michael Lua, is hoping to spotlight their story with his new book, Strangers in the Land. And he joins Walter Isaacson to discuss the group's more than a century-long struggle to belong.
Thank you, Biana and Michael Lua. Welcome to the show.
It's great to be here with you, Walter.
This book about Chinese immigration into America starting in the 1840s with the gold rush is sweeping history, but also somewhat personal. You weave your own family's life into it. It began with some incident that happened to you. That's how you started coming to write this book. Explain that to us.
Yeah, this was October 2016. We were just a few weeks away from Trump's election. I wasn't expecting it. I think the country wasn't expecting it, but you could feel a curtain of nativism really descending on the country, I think. And this was just an encounter I had on the Upper East Side. There was we were with
Manhattan,
Upper East Side of Manhattan. We were with some friends. I was with my family, 2 daughters. There was a woman who brushed past us and was aggravated that we were in her way. And she muttered under her breath, "Go back to China." And this was Sunday after church, but I did not turn the other cheek. I confess I kind of ran after and got in her face a little bit, and essentially was like, "Are you serious?" And we were going back and forth, and then she screamed at me down the block, "Go back to your effing country," in more colorful language than that. And I was trying to come up with a smart retort, and I in the adrenaline's flowing, and I was just said very pathetically, "I was born in this country," and I ended up. I tweeted about this, and it ended up becoming a viral thing. And I wrote a piece for the New York Times where I was working at the time, and it was an open letter to her that actually the newspaper ended up running on the front page the following day. And I wrote about this feeling of otherizing that I think is common to the Asian American experience. And I wrote about. I was thinking about my kids, my daughter who was in her stroller, my younger daughter, and my older daughter was walking next to me, and I wondered about, even though they're 2 generations removed, my parents' immigrant experience in the 1960s and 1970s, whether they would ever feel like they truly belonged in this country. And so that set me on this journey, intellectual journey, really, and a desire to understand this history better, which I actually realized in the aftermath of this incident, I didn't really know. And I actually think that's common for a lot of people, Asian Americans, Americans in general. This history, even though a lot of historians have done great work on it, is not broadly known.
Well, the history of America is a history of immigration and also a history of nativism, a backlash against immigration. And one of the first big immigration waves is the one you write about, which is in the 1840s, especially because of the gold rush, Chinese immigrants coming in. So let's start with Gold Mountain. I love that part of your book. Tell me how that began at all.
Yeah, I dreamed of finding the first, the kind of patient zero, how this all started. And there actually is an account of and maybe it's apocryphal. There's lore passed along in the Chinese community of a merchant who had arrived in 1847 and was among the legions who ventured into the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. And he wrote this excited letter home to a fellow villager in Guangdong province. And as the story goes, this villager told other people about it and set off himself. Whatever the story, basically, this was like an escalator, really, of people coming, telling their brothers, sons, fathers to come. They had told these stories of Gold Mountain, is what they called it, Gumsan, and people started just getting on boats and coming. They would use their family farms and land as collateral for loans, and by 1860, a tenth of the population in California was Chinese, and as you point out, this really was a global migration, and this was an unprecedented experiment in multiracial democracy that was happening just as the country was debating and this other issue of race on the other side of the country. There was this other experiment that we had not ever gone through, where there were white Americans, Black Americans, immigrants from Europe, and Chinese, and there were these also Californios who were the Mexican settlers who became citizens after California was annexed. It was, and we didn't do particularly well in this test. That's what the book is about.
It's interesting because you talk about on the eastern part of the United States, the slavery issue was happening. The West, the issue of immigration, especially Chinese immigration. And now, more than 150 years later, we're still facing those two things in America. Are they interrelated in some ways?
Oh, totally. I think that's one of the interventions of the book, and I think an intervention that a lot of historians are trying to make nowadays. You need to consider these histories together. This Chinese question, as it was called, the debate over Chinese immigration, coincided with the vanquishing of Reconstruction in the South and the expelling of Native peoples and the eradication of Native peoples in the West, and the Chinese question is part of that. All those histories continue to refract today, and they need to be considered together.
It seems then from your book that the Chinese immigrants were accepted pretty well at first. What turned it around?
I think it was the numbers just started to rise. The welcome that you're talking about. There was city leaders in San Francisco had a public ceremony that welcomed them in 1849, and it was organized by civic leaders and pastors. They were particularly interested in evangelizing the Chinese, and actually the daily newspaper in California at that point, the Alta, which is the first daily newspaper in California, actually wrote very positively about these Chinese arrivals, predicting that one day they'd be in the halls of Congress and they'd be voting and just as influential as other immigrant groups and who become naturalized and American citizens. But what you see is in the 1850s and 1860s, there were horrific episodes of violence in the minefields and that kind of thing. The 1860s, the story of the 1860s was the building of the railroad, which the Chinese were a central part of, particularly building the Central Pacific, the western side of the railroad. And for a moment, there might have been an opening for Chinese to be welcomed because they were essential in this gigantic accomplishment. But there was an economic downturn in the 1870s that really caused the anti-Chinese movement to take off. And political polarization is a big part of the story, too.
Does that echo today, you think?
Oh, it's all the echoes of history, all those cliches or their truths, really, that Mark Twain, or whether he said this or not, that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Like the anti-Chinese movement resembles in a lot of ways the MAGA movement. It's a nimbus of outrage of disaffected white workers, but not just workers, but other people, I think, who felt stuck economically in some way. I think on the West, there was this great expectation that the railroad was going to open up new markets, and actually that turned out to not be true. That actually ended up opening up more competition. And so there's just a number of factors that involve race and the economy, and also the emergence of demagogue-like figures. There was a guy named Dennis Carney who gave these giant rallies in the Sandlot, as they called it, near City Hall in San Francisco, and he railed against corporate power. So there was that populist sort of angle, but he ended his rallies with the rallying cry, "The Chinese must go," and it reminds me a lot of the populism of today.
One of the echoes we have today from your book involves the fact that for the Chinese, after Carney and others started attacking, there was a program of mass deportation. How'd that work out?
It didn't work out very well. What you're referring to is in 1882, they passed what's known today as the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned Chinese laborers from entering the country. And they continued to pass increasingly more onerous versions of this law. And in 1892, there was a renewal of Chinese exclusion that was known as the Geary Act, and it required that Chinese register en masse in order to justify their existence in the country. If they didn't register, they would be subject to deportation. The Chinese actually, it's incredible, organized a campaign of mass resistance, and very few Chinese registered, and they made a court challenge. It took it all the way to the Supreme Court, and they actually wound up losing. But there was talk with all these Chinese who refused to register and refused to be photographed as part of this. There was talk of deporting them en masse, and the funny thing was, the Department of Commerce concluded that they didn't have the funds to do this, that they didn't have enough money allocated in the Treasury to do this, because, it costs a certain amount to ship somebody back to China. It would also cost money to deploy people, to arrest people and detain them and all this kind of stuff. And they didn't have the money. Eventually, after the Supreme Court ruled against the Chinese, they eventually did wind up registering. And so that effort on mass deportation the need for that went away.
Despite the racism and violence directed at the Chinese immigrants, here's something you write in the book. The Chinese in America were not simply the victims of barbarous violence and repression, they were the protagonists in the story of America. Tell me about some of those protagonists you found in researching this book.
Yeah, I'm very proud of the way it was a little bit like panning for gold in the archives. As you know, the archives history is written by the powerful, and the powerless are often left out. And so you have to do some panning for gold in the archives for the stories of people and characters, and there are incredible stories there. I think of any number of them. The story of Young Wing, who was the first university student, Chinese, to enroll at an American university. He graduated from Yale, and he led this Chinese educational mission that brought Chinese students to America. I think of In Poon Chu, who came as a young boy and converted to Christianity and became a pastor, and then a newspaper publisher and a spokesman for the Chinese community. I think of just ordinary stories of immigration and people who built their lives here. They're throughout the book, and I think that's what I'm trying to do. In the end, I think in the book, the Chinese as a collective people end up as the central protagonists of the book, and you get invested in them and root for them and get upset for them and sad for them. And but it's the stories of individual Chinese that help enliven this history and make it memorable.
The 1965, I think it was, act that lifted the quota that was holding down Chinese immigration. It was signed by Lyndon Johnson. Why did he sign it? What was the point?
Yeah. So Lyndon Johnson, this was part of him carrying on the legacy of JFK after the Civil Rights Act. This is what he took up next. And the thing that's important to know is that for proponents of the bill, they never expected that it was going to dramatically change the demographics of the country. This was really important for its passage. It was a little bit of a math mistake, to be honest. Because it prioritized people with special skills and family reunification, the way the proponents of the bill rationalized it was like, okay, there's a certain number of this group, and that group. And so when they bring over their families, we're just going to have the demographics of the country are going to be roughly the same. When Lyndon Johnson signed the bill, he reassured the American public that this is not a revolutionary bill. What they underestimated really was the power of family reunification and Asian immigrants, once the doors were open to them, brought many family members over, and that just kind of snowballed. And you see that with other groups too. And that's what set in motion the demographic transformation that we're experiencing today.
One of the political issues today involves China in a geopolitical sense, a strategic sense, a competition with China, fights with China over everything from chips and tariffs and things like that. Is that at all connected to the anti-immigrant sentiments that you may have felt on the Upper East Side from that racist woman?
I mean, I think so. So the interesting thing is in this history that I write about, which is centered on the late 19th century and early 20th century, China was incredibly weak. It was torn by war, internecine warfare. It was kind of humiliated with the Western powers. Today, obviously, China is an economic, technological, military superpower. And we're in this competition with China for dominance. And I think during the pandemic, when there was this the blame of China for COVID led to this outbreak in reports of violence against Asians. Obviously, that moment has subsided. But the thing that I'm afraid of at this moment, and that what I worry about in the trajectory of the Asian Americans and their experience in America is, every time, right now, it's kind of in vogue for politicians of both parties, Democrats and Republicans, to be bellicose in their language about China. And I think there are legitimate reasons, for that. But every time I hear that kind of language, I feel the tinder of racial suspicion growing. And so the thing a lot of people have asked me about, am I optimistic? And I have to be optimistic because that's the story of America. That's the story of this kind of push and pull that you've talked about. But I'm worried.
Michael Lua, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
We turn now to what our next guest calls the big debt cycle. Financier Ray Dalio says understanding this cycle is critical for helping policymakers, investors, and the general public grasp where we are and where we are headed with the debt. In his new book, Dalio provides solutions and details how America could avoid fiscal crisis. He shares his insights with Walter Isaacson.
Thank you, Bianna and Ray Dalio. Welcome back to the show.
Oh, it's so good to be back.
The big, beautiful bill, as Trump calls it, has passed the House. The Senate's now wrestling with it. It seems like it would add maybe $2.4 trillion to the deficit, and by the last estimates. Is that a really bad thing? Should we worry about that bill adding too much to the deficit?
I think that if there's one thing I can give people, and I'm compelled to give people now, it's an understanding of the mechanics and the supply demand so that people will understand how to answer that question, which is why, as a global investor for 50 years who's been through many of these, I wanted to pass along, my book, my description of the mechanics. So in answering your question, I want to say why it's a compelling moment, and that if they do not bring it down to 3% of GDP from where it'll be about 7% of GDP. They have to bring it down by 4% of GDP, that there is very high likelihood of real problems.
Now you say you got to bring it down by more than half the amount of the deficit. Can that be done with spending cuts alone, or do you think they should let some of the tax cuts expire?
It has to be done by three things. There is, and it has to be spread out among these three things, because any one of those three things would be too painful. And those three things are tax revenue, spending cuts, and interest rates. Although Congress and the president and the process does not deal directly with the third of those, right now $1 trillion, half of our deficit, is interest payments. And not only do we have $1 trillion interest payments, in the next year, we have $9 trillion of debt maturing that has to be either rolled over or sold.
Well, wait, doesn't that mean interest rates are going to not go down if we're adding more to the deficit and they have all this expiring?
That's right. So there is what I call my 3% three-part solution, which was very similar to 1991 to 98. It was cut by 5% of GDP. The budget deficit in those years was cut by 5% of GDP by spreading it around. So the three things are needed. So if there's a mantra that about 4%, here's the magnitudes of it. About 4%, if it came from tax revenue, doesn't mean tax rates, but it could be tax revenue. 4% was cut from the budget deficit. That would naturally change the supply-demand picture to bring down interest rates by 1 to 1.5%, which would itself reduce the deficit by another 2% or so.
But let me push on that question of how are you going to raise more revenues? You say it's not just by allowing tax cuts to expire, but don't some of those tax cuts have to expire if your 333 solution is going to work?
Where it comes is a political question. In other words, yes, you can let the tax expire, or so many different ways. You can do so many different ways.
Well, let me ask, what would you do? You're one of the wealthiest people. The tax cuts help you. What would you do in terms of those tax cuts that are for the wealthy?
I would allow important tax increases in a way that also, my own view would be improve education, improve productivity in a way that raises productivity for most people, and so on. But this is not my political. Okay, I want to say whether you turn left or you turn right. What I'm seeing when I go down there, and I speak to both sides of Congress, who are the people who are responsible for this. Nobody disagrees with the need to go to 3% of GDP in that number. And what I'm seeing in politics is that there is, it's like being on a ship that's headed to rocks. And there are those who want to turn right and those who want to turn left. And they're so hell-bent on arguing of whether they turn right or left that they will not get past, they're going to hit the rocks.
President Trump seems to be trying to jawbone the Fed chairman, Jay Powell, into cutting interest rates. Does that make any sense to try to jawbone that? And would the bond market permit that?
If interest rates are unnaturally cut by the central bank printing money or pushing down interest rates unnaturally, The bond market will not want to own that. Think about when you're owning a bond, what you're getting is interest rates. So the dollar will go down, the value of money will go down, and it's discouraging.
On Sunday, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said that tariffs would help bring in enough money that we wouldn't end up having as big of a deficit. Does that ring true to you?
We're now in a world geopolitical situation that relates to many things such as self-sufficiency and so on. It can bring in a lot of money. It also creates a less efficient world economy. So how the deficits or how the tariffs are put into place, what amounts how, has to be done scientifically to get away with that tax revenue. So tax revenue can come from that, but that is a matter of surgery, and it has to be done carefully, and it has to be done moderately so as to not disrupt that. I'm concerned about that, but that is not going to be enough.
In your book, by the way, you are in favor of some tariffs moderately applied in a scientific way that's not just helter-skelter. Explain why you're in favor of that and why you think the way Trump is doing it may not be effective.
We have a giant imbalance. The world, the United States, is the largest consumer in the world. And it's largely because the U.S. government gets in debt and distributes the money, and it's a consumer. As we have correctly, we've lost our ability to manufacture. China is the largest manufacturer in the world and is in the other side of that. They lend us the money to borrow to buy their goods. And now we have a big imbalance. We have a capital imbalance and we have a trade imbalance between that in a world that there's a risk of going to war. And so as we deal with self-sufficiency, increasingly, we have to become more self-sufficient. It's a reality in this. And we have to become more balanced in that one way or another. So if that's done economically, we have a population that is not productive and manufacturing. We now have a great polarity of wealth. 60% of Americans have below a sixth grade reading level. And there's a productivity problem and there's an economic problem. So if that is dealt with in a scientific and a balanced way, that could have some benefits. It's not a black and white situation, but it has to be done with that kind of thoroughness and so on. One way or another, the imbalances will go away. The debt imbalances, the trade imbalances, the capital imbalances, because they cannot be sustained in the world that now exists. So that it's coming to an end.
Wait, when you say the one way or the other, they'll go away, that sort of the other sounds pretty ominous to me. What are you worried about?
I'm worried about all of, let's go back to the debt. I'm worried about that the demand for those bonds will not be equal to the supply. And I'm worried that as the debt now is at this point where it starts to, you have to acquire debt to service debt. You have to borrow money to service it, $10 trillion a year in debt service. That when you have that kind of condition, that you will have an unsustainable situation so that the central bank, the Federal Reserve, will be put into a position of either being seeing interest rates rise a lot because of that problem, crowding out other spending, and costing it money because they own a lot of bonds, and letting that happen, or then having to print money and buy those bonds, which depreciates the value. Very similar to the 1970s.
Do you think then there's a chance or a likelihood of a recession?
We're certainly going to have, we always have recessions. Now, just imagine what happens if you have a recession. On average, since 1945, when the New World Order began, we've had 12 and a half cycles, of which there have always been recessions. You're always going to have a recession. I am very worried that this set of circumstances Well, assuredly, we will have a recession. And then the deficits go up. And then it's very difficult at that time because people are at each other's throats. So there's going to be an internal fight. The important thing is to deal with this now, okay? Before you have a lot more debt, before you have a lot more compounding of the debt, before you have a recession.
Let me read you a sentence from the book, your book, that kind of made me snap my head. It says, quote, "The policies President Trump is using to, quote, make America great again are remarkably like the policies that those of the hard right countries in the 1930s used." Tell me what you mean by that.
What I mean by that is the 1930s was a period that had a debt crisis. The governments were dysfunctional, and four democracies chose to go to more autocratic policies for somebody to get control of the situation in order to fix the situation. So that you had a debt problem. What Germany did, and a number of countries, is that they essentially defaulted on the debt. They didn't pay the debt, and then you have that more autocratic type of policy because the people want somebody to get control of this situation. And then you have the classic conflict between the left and the right. Okay, this has happened repeatedly, the left and the right. And then you have a fight between the left and the right. This has happened repeatedly. I'm referring to the 30s, but this has happened repeatedly throughout history.
And do you think that it's happening now in the United States, that we're slipping towards an autocracy?
Yes, I do, because the people want somebody to get control of this thing. And so what you see it yourself, we're now questioning, there's a challenge. How does the legal system work? Who has what rights? The possibility of if there was a not accepting an election result. These things are very real today.
When you talk about perhaps we're moving into an autocracy, there's another sentence in your book that struck me, which is, as shown in history, the transfer of power from democracy to autocracy was more often than not orderly within the democracy because people were sick and tired of the system failing to work and wanted to give power to a leader who would take control of the mass and make it work well. Do you think it's partly a desire of people in the United States to move to a more autocratic system?
There is a very clear, strong desire for somebody to get control of this and a willingness to have that more autocratic type of vote to deliver those results. Yes, I think so.
When you talk about the potential of getting more revenues, I think in your book, you even talk about maybe having a 2% increase in the income tax. Would you make that part of your 333 solution package?
Sure.
And what about
I think what's required is a little bit from everybody and everything.
And what about the expenditure cuts? Would you cut the military?
I think as you go down that prioritization, these are questions that are political questions that have now, because of our debt service being so high, we have very little room to cut anything that we don't think is essential. So now you're having the representatives in Congress having to make that choice, but they better make the choice as to whether it's the military or whether it's something else or something else and something else. I don't really care. Cut it, get to something like a 4% cut, and that's not easy. So where that happens, because if we lose our economic well-being, if we lose our health economically and our power economically, if we lose the dollar as a world reserve currency, it reverberates through not only American power around the world, it reverberates through the world because the dollar, the U.S. bond market, the treasury market is the backbone of all markets. And so that could produce that kind of trauma. So how they get there in the particular trade-offs are for those experts and those representatives in Washington to weigh those considerations. It's not for me to weigh those considerations.
Well, if you're going to have something that's a 3-3-3 solution, that would seem to require a grand bargain. One of those things where Democrats and Republicans meet and do the trade-offs. Those used to be done in the days of Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, for example. Our politics seems unsuited to that now. Do you think a grand bargain is possible?
I don't think it's likely that we're going to have any grand bargain until after the 2026 midterm elections. I think that this is what's going to happen. The budget will pass. It'll be this situation that I'm describing. And then what my hope would be is that there's a mandatory bipartisan solution, that they create the equivalent of a Manhattan Projects and so on, and create a mandatory bipartisan way of dealing with that. Do I think that's likely? I don't think it's likely. I think that, but if we don't achieve a bipartisan situation, we're going to have a financial crisis and be fighting with each other. So hopefully the compelling nature of this before we have a recession, which will make that situation worse.
Ray Dalio, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Walter.